The world awoke to flashing news tickers and urgent headlines. Indonesia was deploying troops to the Israel-Lebanon border, unexpected, unannounced. Breaking news banners screamed across screens from New York to Tokyo. Newsrooms erupted in chaos, phones ringing, producers demanding answers. Indonesia, a staunch supporter of Palestine, was sending a full battalion under the UNIFIL banner. The move sent shockwaves through the global diplomatic community. Jerusalem called it a provocation and a direct threat to national security. Images of Indonesian soldiers in blue UN helmets boarding planes dominated the news. The world held its breath. Indonesia's move began quietly, under the cover of diplomatic routine. Jakarta announced a major increase to its UNIFIL peacekeeping force. This time, a full mechanized battalion with armored vehicles and advanced surveillance gear. The scale and secrecy caught everyone off guard. Officially, it was a routine rotation, but the timing and lack of consultation raised red flags. Israel's reaction was swift and furious. The Ministry of Defense called the deployment a hostile act disguised as peacekeeping. For Israel, these were not neutral soldiers. They were from a nation that refused to recognize its existence. Indonesia countered, insisting its troops were under a UN mandate, not acting as an Indonesian force. Jakarta pointed to its long history of UN peacekeeping, from Africa to the Balkans. But for Israel, the blue helmets did little to mask the nationality beneath. The diplomatic back and forth only heightened the tension. The United Nations urged calm, reiterating the neutral mandate of its mission. The world watched a classic standoff, one nation asserting its right to peacekeeping, another feeling directly threatened. The spark had been lit. The fire was beginning to spread. The crisis was no longer just about troop movements. It was about trust, identity, and the limits of international law. In Israel, tension was immediate and intense. Cafes in Tel Aviv buzzed with anxious conversation. People scrolled through news updates, faces tight with concern. The Knesset convened an emergency session, debate fierce and divided. Hardliners demanded action to block the Indonesian troops. Moderates urged caution. Prime Minister Netanyahu huddled with top security officials as the military went on high alert along the northern border. Patrols increased, drones flew over the blue line, and the IDF prepared for any scenario. Military officials warned of the risks. What if the Indonesian contingent wasn't neutral? What if they aided Israel's enemies? For ordinary Israelis, the crisis revived memories of past wars and a sense of being surrounded. Talk radio and social media buzzed with calls for the government to stand firm. The deployment was not just a geopolitical move. It was a personal threat felt in homes across the country. The nation watched the northern horizon, waiting for the next move. Jakarta's message was one of calm resolve and national pride. The government insisted its troops were deploying solely to serve peace under the UN Security Council. Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi addressed the world, highlighting Indonesia's decades-long peacekeeping record. The Garuda contingent had served with distinction in conflict zones worldwide. This deployment, officials argued, was a continuation of a proud tradition, not a provocation. For Indonesia, it was about more than a UN mission. It was a statement of national identity and solidarity with Palestine. The military emphasized professionalism, cultural sensitivity, and strict adherence to UN rules of engagement. Indonesian troops were portrayed as guardians of peace, not warriors. The message: judge us by our actions, not by unfounded fears. Indonesia was stepping up, refusing to be a passive observer. We are peacekeepers. We are here at the request of the United Nations, and we will fulfill our mission with honor. Israel's concerns ran deep, rooted in decades of conflict and mistrust. Officials questioned how a nation that denies Israel's existence could be a neutral peacekeeper. Security briefings detailed fears. Would Indonesian troops ignore Hezbollah's activities? Leak intelligence? The UNIFIL mission requires coordination with the IDF. Could sensitive information be compromised? Israel's mistrust of international bodies, especially the UN, only fueled anxiety. The government insisted peacekeeping requires trust, and that trust was absent. Israel lodged a formal protest at the UN, demanding a review of the force's composition. The message national security is non-negotiable. The crisis exposed stark contrasts in public opinion. In Indonesia, rallies and social media celebrated the deployment as a moment of national pride and solidarity with Palestine. Hashtags like #Indonesia4Peace trended for days. In Israel, the mood was anxious and defiant. Citizens questioned the UN's impartiality and the government's response. Political debates mirrored public sentiment, near unanimous support in Indonesia, deep divisions in Israel. Indonesian leaders framed the move as a patriotic duty and a step toward global leadership. In the Knesset, the government faced pressure from all sides, some demanding military action, others urging restraint. The crisis exposed deep fissures in Israeli politics. Both nations felt the weight of history and identity in every decision. The air was thick with uncertainty. The standoff sent shockwaves across the Middle East and beyond. Arab states walked a diplomatic tightrope, balancing public sympathy for Indonesia with new ties to Israel. Most called for de-escalation and respect for UN mandates, avoiding direct confrontation. The US engaged in urgent diplomacy, reaffirming support for Israel while recognizing Indonesia's regional importance. American officials worked behind the scenes to prevent escalation. The UN faced a credibility test, caught between two member states with irreconcilable positions. Secretary General Guterres emphasized the impartiality of UNIFIL and the strict rules binding all peacekeepers. Russia and China framed the crisis as a failure of US diplomacy, supporting Indonesia's right to participate. European nations echoed calls for calm, fearing regional destabilization. The world fragmented into camps, each with its own agenda. The crisis became a test of the international order. As tensions peaked, leaders addressed their nations and the world. In Jakarta, President Joko Widodo spoke of Indonesia's duty to world peace and solidarity with Palestine, praising the Garuda contingent. The speech unified the nation and signaled Indonesia's resolve. In Jerusalem, Prime Minister Netanyahu declared Israel would not risk its security, warning that any non-recognizing peacekeeper would be seen as a threat. He vowed to take all necessary measures to protect Israeli citizens. These speeches were more than domestic messaging. They were signals to the world. Indonesia asserted its sovereignty and moral convictions, refusing to back down. Israel drew a red line, emphasizing self-reliance and the primacy of security. Both leaders enjoyed broad public support. The deployment became a symbol of Indonesia's rising stature. For Israelis, the crisis was about survival, not diplomacy. Neither side blinked. The stage was set for a prolonged standoff. The standoff settled into a tense stalemate. Israel demanded the exclusion of Indonesian troops from UNIFIL. Indonesia, backed by allies, refused. The UN scrambled for a diplomatic solution. The crisis signaled a shift in the global order. Indonesia, once a quiet giant, now demanded a seat at the table. The incident raised tough questions about the future of UN peacekeeping. Could host nations veto troop contributors? Could the UN remain neutral? As of November 29, 2025, the situation remained unresolved. Indonesian troops waited at a staging area. The Israeli military stayed on high alert. The world watched, hoping for peace, but bracing for escalation. The standoff was more than a regional dispute. It was a glimpse into a new multipolar world and the challenges it brings.